Rahul sir, kindly unmute yourself. You are unaudible on the online mode.
Okay. So am I audible now?
Yes, sir. Perfectly.
Okay. So just once again, I extend my warm and hearty welcome to everyone to this ICPR Study Circle lecture series. Uh, Today we have Professor Rinita Majumdar, who will be speaking on feminism and psychoanalysis. We have retired professor from Janki Devi Memorial College, University of Delhi, Professor Ruplekha Khullar, who has kindly agreed to chair this lecture today. So before we formally begin, I would request our speaker of the day and our head of the department to kindly garland on the statue of our revered Malviya ji. I would also request Professor Durgesh Chaudhary sir and Professor S.C. Dubey sir, please join to garland. So as our tradition goes, I would like to request Dr. Rajiv Lochan Behra to please come and recite the Mangalacharan.
ॐ गुरुर्ब्रह्मा गुरुर्विष्णु गुरुर्देव महेश्वर गुरुर्साक्षात् परब्रह्म तस्मै श्रीगुरवे नमः वक्रतुण्ड महाकाय सूर्यकोटिसमप्रभा निर्विघ्नं कुरु मम देवस्य सर्वकार्येषु सर्वदा. Oh, now it's over to the convener.
Thank you, Dr. Rajiv. As our long tradition goes, next request upon our research scholar, Kajal, Susmita, and Raj Lakshmi, and other students to please join for Kulgit recital. Thank you.
मधुर मनोहर अतीव सुंदर ये सर्व विद्या की राजधानी राजधानी मधुर मनोहर अतीव सुंदर ये सर्व विद्या की राजधानी राजधानी यह तीनों लोक से न्यारी काशी सुज्ञान धर्म सत्य काशी बसी है गंगा की रम्य तट पर, ये सर्व विद्या की राजधानी, राजधानी। मधुर मनोहर अतीव सुंदर, ये सर्व विद्या की राजधानी, राजधानी। नई नई है ये ईट पत्थर, है विश्वकर्मा सुंदर, रचे विद्या की भव्य मंदिर, ये सर्व सृष्टि की राजधानी, राजधानी। यहाँ की है पवित्र शिक्षा की सत्य बिके हरिश्चंद्र थे यहीं पर, ये सत्य शिक्षा की राजधानी, राजधानी। वह वेद ईश्वर की सत्य वाणी, बने जिन्हें पढ़ के ब्रह्म ज्ञानी, हे व्यास जी ने रचे यहीं पर, ये समवेद्या की राजधानी, राजधानी। वह मुक्ति पद को दिलाने वाले, सुधर्म चलाने वाले, यहीं फले फूले बुद्ध शंकर, ये राज ऋषियों की राजधानी, राजधानी। सुरम्य धारा से नहा में कबीर तुलसी, भला हो कविता का क्यों न आकर, ये वाग विद्या की राजधानी, राजधानी। विविध कला अर्थशास्त्र गायन, गणित खनिज प्रतीचि प्राची का मेल सुंदर, ये विश्वविद्या की राजधानी, राजधानी। यह मालवीय जी की देशभक्ति, ये उनका साहस, ये उनकी शक्ति। यह मालवीय जी की देशभक्ति, ये उनका साहस, ये उनकी शक्ति। प्रकट हुई है नवीन होकर, ये कर्मवीरों की राजधानी, राजधानी। मधुर मनोहर अतीव सुंदर, ये सर्व विद्या की राजधानी, राजधानी। मधुर मनोहर अतीव सुंदर, ये सर्व विद्या की राजधानी, राजधानी।
Thank you so much to all of you for such a wonderful recitation of Kulgit. Now I would like to request our head of the department, Professor Anand Misra, to please felicitate our speaker. Thank you so much, sir. Now I would request our head, Professor Anand Misra, to please come over the podium and formally welcome our speaker and chair of the session. Thank you.
Hariyo, Honorable Chairperson Dr. Roop Lekha Kullarji, our learned speaker Professor Rinita Majumdar, convener of the program Dr. Rahul Moria ji, our colleagues, students, scholars presented offline or online. I, on behalf of the Department of Philosophy and Religion, welcome you in this ICPR study circle lecture of the department. Friends, this is really a great privilege for us that feminist scholar Professor Rinita Majumdar is here with us. She has accepted our invitation to deliver a lecture in ICPR Study Circle program. Professor Rinita Majumdar is an established scholar of feminism, psychology, philosophy. She teaches Navinyay in her college at US. So we are really lucky that she is here in person. I, on behalf of the Department of Philosophy and Religion and all our colleagues, welcome you, madam. I also welcome Dr. Roop Lekha Kullarji, who has accepted our invitation to preside over the lecture. She has been long associated with different colleges and main campus of Delhi University, a scholar of philosophy of law and feminism. I welcome you, madam, on behalf of the department. I also welcome Professor Gangadharji, Professor G.P. Das, and other scholars, Dr. Jay Singh, here in the department, Professor Drugesh Chaudhary, Professor S.C. Dubey, Dr. Kalpana ji, Dr. Priyanka Misra, Professor Jyosna Srivastav, Dr. Baleshwar Yadav ji, and so many students, research scholars who are present in the seminar hall. I welcome you all. I especially welcome Dr. Rajkumar Singh. He has become a regular participant of our seminars. Dr. Rajkumar Singh. Similarly, I welcome K.K. Misra ji. I welcome all other scholars and friends connected offline or online in this lecture. All of you are most welcome. Over to you.
Thank you so much, sir, for your warm and exciting welcome. Before we really formally begin, let me introduce our speaker as well as the chair for this talk. Professor Rinita Majumdar has obtained her PhD in philosophy from the University of Massachusetts. She has also obtained MA in psychology from University of Phoenix and MA in philosophy from Brock University, Canada. and Calcutta University. She is currently affiliated uh, with Central New Mexico Community College, where she is professor now and affiliate professor of women, gender, and sexuality studies at the University of New Mexico, USA. Her research area includes philosophy of mind, epistemology, feminist theories, psychoanalysis. She has also various teaching assignments and has taught at University of Massachusetts, uh, Texas, and New Mexico Institute of Mining, New Mexico. She has also authored various books, which includes Introduction to Feminist Theory, Feminist Economics, Feminine Sexuality, Feminist Theories, Understanding Gender. And she has also authored one novel called Poison Paddy, as well as a book of poetry called Siva's Dreams. So I welcome you, ma'am, to this uh, ICPR Study Circle lecture. We have with us uh, Professor Rooplekha Khullar, who will be chairing this lecture. Professor Rooplekha Khullar has taught at Philosophy, uh, Department of Philosophy, Janki Devi Memorial College, and she has also taught at various colleges in Delhi University from 1982 to 2021. She joined JDMC in 1988 and taught in the Department of Philosophy till her retirement in March 2021. Her areas of interest are philosophy of law, analytic philosophy, and feminism. During her tenure, she served on several committees in the college at IGNU and in DU Department of Philosophy. Besides all this, there is one fact that I have been her colleague in the same college where I taught for nearly 4 years before I joined this department. So uh, I would like to request to our speaker, Professor Rinita Majumdar, please deliver your lecture. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Am I audible? Good afternoon, and thank you all. It feels so privileged to be in this sacred hall. I was looking around, and all these great thinkers are watching us while we are delivering. Philosophy started, I don't know when it started. The Western bias is, of course, the 5th century BC in the Agora, in the marketplace with Socrates' midwifery. Midwifery can only happen during childbirth. So that itself, I think the start of philosophy could be feminism, at least in the West. And in our system, I think feminism is all over. It's all over, it's just not explored. So thanks to Dr. Mishra, who has been so kind to invite me, to Dr. Rahul for conducting this whole thing, and Dr. Khullar also for chairing this, and to all of you for being present to listen to feminism and psychoanalysis, which is sometimes they can be very complex and tiring, actually, feminism and psychoanalysis. And I'm very grateful that all of you are here. I will read and stop and say, and then again read the paper. So we approach feminism and psychoanalysis in a way that neither an empirical psychologist would approach, nor someone trained in social sciences would approach. So the title of my paper is a little bizarre. I'm going to read it. Feminine Subjectivity, the Open Wound, and the Return of the Hysteric, a philosophical and psychoanalytic inquiry. But philosophers are not foreigners to bizarreness and oddity. So That's why I wouldn't dare to bring this title in any other discipline. I will, the open wound is actually the central theme of my discourse here. The question of subjectivity remains an elusive and complex notion in feminist theories. The only reference to the feminine subject that we get in the standard philosophical, political, and psychoanalytic theories are all constructed along the lines of difference. Difference from what? From the centered subject, the subject of knowledge, certainty, or ethical decision making, such as the Cartesian cogito or the Kant's synthetic unity of a perception, or the Kantian goodwill, are subjects of knowledge, or in the case of goodwill, can execute the categorical imperative. Feminine subjectivity is associated with an other or a lack or lacking. As we'll see in the next few pages, this lack is filled with a variety of attributes, of which some are as follows: open wound, hysteric, melancholic, and the macabre or absurd. Ultimately, this open wound reveals the gaps and aporias in society and culture, and reveals all identities and subjectivities as illusory. The open wound erupts and closes in a cyclic fashion in culture and resists oppressive power structures, and contributes to the collective process of healing and transforming the species. In his Politics, Aristotle said that all political associations aim at some good and have a purpose. For example, the state, household, and individuals all have some purpose. For Aristotle, space was divided into two spheres: the public sphere or the polis, where rational free men discussed the organization and planning of the city-states, and the oikos, or the household, where the function of production and reproduction happened. While the purpose of the state was to create happy lives for all, the purpose of the family was purely economics. That is, production of things needed for daily lives and reproduction and nurturing of children. The inhabitants of the oikos were Greek women and slaves, both of whom were excluded from the polis. For Aristotle, Greek women naturally have confused rationality and hence were unable to participate in rational discussion that happened in the polis. Because of the confused rationality, they cannot be independent and must be guided by the rational Greek male. Their function was the reproduction and nurturing of the Greek species. The slaves, on the other hand, had no rationality and hence must be dependent and must follow the rational master. Nonetheless, the slave, as Aristotle theorized, had great manual strength, and hence their labor was used for the production of goods needed for daily lives. Here we get the first glimpse of women's nature or feminine subjectivity as those having confused rationality. The feminine identity as lacking rationality was the theoretical assumption of the 19th century social, anthropological, and medical sciences in modern times in the Western world. Aristotle's naturalism, both gender as well as slavery, was questioned by the European humanist of the 17th and the 18th century. A fallout of this is the liberal concept was the ideological construction of the abstract, right-bearing individual having no specific identities or location. This was the basis of modern European humanism that formed the background assumption of the liberal politics of Locke, Rousseau, and Voltaire. The concept of this right-bearing individual made the model for the first wave liberal feminist in the 19th century. Liberal feminists like Mary Wollstonecraft based women's emancipation on an assimilative model that everyone should mimic the abstract, right-bearing universal individual with no identity or location. Against Aristotle's naturalism, Wollstonecraft located the subordination of women on socio-cultural reasons. According to Wollstonecraft, women's subordinated position was not natural, but due to socio-political cultural exclusion of women and their confinement in the domestic sphere. According to Wollstonecraft, women would no longer be subordinate if they're part of the political system. That is, given the right to vote, be educated and become self-sufficient and earn their own livelihood and support themselves. Thus, liberal the realm of socio-cultural economic spheres. This surely was enhanced advancement for women and democracy in general. Nonetheless, the liberal feminists based their model on the emancipation, on the universal masculine right-bearing rational individual of European enlightenment, and has its own deficiencies. This new model of the right-bearing individual was based on the notion of citizenship that reconfigured the public-private distinction in a new way. According to this new model, there's a space of privacy for the right-bearing individual against the state, where the individual can exercise his right to property, ownership, free gathering and discussion, right to practice his own faith and belief, and have some amount of control over his sexuality and reproduction. The model was copied and transferred by liberal feminists, where a private space was kept outside of the gaze of the state. In fact, the family was reconceived as the sacred sphere where the state could not penetrate. The problem is that the family became part of this private sphere, and hence issues of domestic violence, reproduction, the choice to reproduce were all part of this private sphere where the state could not intervene. This does not mean, however, that the state was completely inactive in the lives of people. It did exercise power to control reproduction and sexuality. This was an assimilative model and failed to emancipate all women of all times. For example, within the model, wage labor was the way to emancipate women, thereby excluding those who are already part of the wage labor, such as working class women, and yet who worked did not have equality. In addition, it failed to give an emancipatory ideology for the women in the colonized space. The primary reason for this is that this model worked on the abstract notion of the right-bearing universal individual without taking into account the different identities of the individual in actual situatedness. In other words, this model did not have a philosophy of identity or subjectivity, or how via actual situated experience, both the subject as well as the other is formed. Women were asked to assimilate to the male model without taking into account the difference from this abstract model. Hence, the model was based on exclusion of many identities. In 1949, with the publication of her groundbreaking work, The Second Sex, Simone de Beauvoir inquired into what constitutes femininity or feminine subjectivity, especially in relation to its difference from male identity. In embarking on a historical, sociological, and anthropological inquiry, de Beauvoir found that women are not merely different from the male or the center, but are others. In order to understand this concept of otherness, de Beauvoir evoked the Hegelian master-slave dialectics, which gives the most significant definition of what constitutes otherness. Hegel's understanding of the dialectical movement of thought leads him to take issue with the idealist notion of reason. Reason is not, as the Kantian idealists claim, a matter of fitting isolated objects into universal categories. Reason involves self-conscious ego struggling to assimilate objects while having to fend off their otherness, which it sees as a threat to its existence as a self-conscious being. Each identity or subject emerges into subjectivity by having an object, its other, as Hegel showed in his master-slave dialectics. Thus, the master is the master in relation to the slave, while the slave is a slave in relation to the master. Hegel clearly showed that in order to have a subject position or subjectivity, there must be an other of the subject, an object in relation to whom the subject gains his or her identity. According to Hegel, the master is an independent consciousness whose other is the dependent consciousness, the slave. The master needs recognition from the slave in order to be the master. The slave, the object in this relationship, is dependent on the master for his existence and his identity. His identity is the other of the master. Gradually, however, in Hegel, the relationship reverses. The slave, by working with nature, gets his independent, although he's dependent on the master for his existence and identity. The master, who is not in touch with nature, becomes dependent on the slave for his embodied existence. He thus becomes the new master, which asserts the other, and the dialectics proceeds. For de Beauvoir, femininity or the feminine subject is this other. Its essence is otherness. What does this mean? It is not an otherness of this or that culture, but an otherness as such. That is an otherness of all cultures, of all times, a historical. For example, according to Simone de Beauvoir, the otherness of ethnic minorities or the working class evolved at a certain point in history. But the otherness of women or femininity is trans-historical. The paradoxical thing about the feminine otherness, although, is that although it's universal and trans-historical, it is not biological or natural as Aristotle theorized, but a creation of culture. Simone de Beauvoir argues for this otherness by taking concepts from anthropologist Levi Strauss. Let us explore a little bit before we go into psychoanalysis. In his book, Totem and Taboo, Freud showed that despite vast diversities in rules and taboos amongst tribes, there is one universal taboo in all tribes, the taboo of incest. In some mythical past, according to Freud, the father of the tribe kept all the women to himself. One day, the brothers rose up in revolt and killed father and ate his flesh and drank his blood. In this last totemic meal, they made a contract that none of them will enjoy any woman. They will transfer them to the other tribe. This idea of transferring or exchanging was used by anthropologist Marcel Mauss to show that in the absence of states, tribes maintain tribal alliance through a complex gift-giving system. The other side of gift-giving, there would be war. This idea of gift-giving and exchange was taken over by anthropologist Levi Strauss, a student of Marcel Mauss. Levi Strauss, through his research among the tribes, showed that there is a continuous gift-giving by one tribe to another. He also showed that the other side of gift is war, whose purpose is to create alliance. In fact, gift-giving became a sacred duty amongst tribes. There were often taboos and rules against growing the food that one can get via exchange. For example, if a tribe grew sweet potato and exchanged it, then the other tribe would grow wheat and exchange it for sweet potatoes with the first tribe. So growing wheat was prohibited in the first tribe because they would get it via exchange, while growing sweet potato is a taboo for the second tribe because they would get it from the first tribe. There are, however, tangible commodities and do not foster permanent bondage. To create permanent bondage, there must be a universal commodity of exchange. Levi Strauss found this universal commodity of exchange in women. The purpose of exchanging women was to create tribal bondage across tribes, for it is the creation of kinship and eventually a bondage of blood by sharing children. Thus, human beings, according to Levi Strauss, stepped from subhuman to human culture when they started exchanging women and institutionalizing marriage. Exchange of women is universal, so as the taboo on incest. Women, however, were not parties to this transaction. Thus, women were transacted for land, goods, title, kingdoms, and other women. This institutionalized universal commodification or exchange of women is what made women the other of culture. This is the idea that de Beauvoir took to say that women or femininity can be defined as the supreme other of all cultures. So femininity here is not the subject of knowledge or a self, but an other, something that has no proper place in creating history. While liberal feminism modeled femininity on the subjectivity of right-bearing individual of the European Enlightenment, de Beauvoir gave a notion of feminine subject that is the other and hence not properly a subject or self. So femininity became a subject only via difference or othering. What is the root of this othering of the feminine subject? When asked, Levi Strauss said that because women are commodities of exchange, of transaction to create kinship. When further asked if groups of women could have transacted men, Levi Strauss said yes, but also said that in reality it never happened. When prodded further, Levi Strauss said that this is because there is always a scarcity of this commodity in nature due to the deep polygamous nature of men. So ultimately, Levi Strauss, despite his cultural explanation, fell back into biology. In fact, the first chapter of the second says, de Beauvoir also said that women were not free due to men's innate biological sexual needs and desire for offspring. And I think she contradicted herself. First, she said it's cultural, and then she went back to biology. So she contradicted herself, I think so. So we see that we goes back to some kind of biologism in order to explain the otherness, which avoids the entire notion of identity and subjectivity of the other. For if everything is reduced to biology, it took Freud and the psychoanalytic movement to explain in depth what otherness meant for subjectivity. Although Freud was a biological determinist, nonetheless, he gave us a theory of identity that is important for us to understand what constitutes an identity in difference through a theory of lack or lacking. So let us next try to understand the psychoanalytic take on femininity, otherness, lack, lacking, wound, etc. Freud was he went to France to be trained as a hypnotist. He was not good at it, so he came back and he began his practice when he started thinking about gender. Freud was a biological determinist who explained human identity in terms of biology and somewhat tried to demystify the concept of human psyche. Freud theorized that the central principle that dominates the human development is the libido or the pleasure principle. The libido has to be understood as a life force that moves through the different body parts and causes the growth and formation of human identity and a sense of self. For Freud, human identity develops as a result of castration complex, which he equated with the death instinct in his later work, Inhibition, Symptoms, and Anxiety. In other words, under the threat of annihilation of the life force or castration complex, as he calls it, the human child develops an ego. According to Freud, we are not born with an ego. Our sense of having a self evolves during infancy and early childhood as the life force or libido travels through the oral, anal, and genital stages. In the oral stage, the anal stage, and the anal stage, when the libido is concentrated on the mouth, and the anal stage on the anus. Pleasure is obtained by passing the feces. Freud also said that this is the anal sadistic stage. At this stages, there is no differentiation between the other and the I, or in Freudian term, between the ego libido and the object libido, and has no consolidated sense of ego or self. It is the time of primary narcissism where there is an absolute unity of the mother and the child. It is a return to this state, Freud claims, that we are striving for in our pursuit of happiness. Returning to this treatment of idealization, it is an ideal state, of course. Freud suggested that this ideal, which is unattainable, condition is what we are looking for in our sexual and emotional and social lives. Every object of our desire is thus idealized. The idea of the other or the object libido develops, according to Freud, in the genital stage when the child enters the Oedipal complex. At this stage, there is a sense of the other. The phallic mother, he never said mother, phallic mother, a mother in fantasy who is all powerful, who gives life and nourishment, and who is also the first object of love for the child. Next, the child develops a complex known as castration complex, that is the loss of pleasure or life force. At this stage, separate identities are developed and consolidated. For the little boy, castration complex gives him the message instinctually that if he does not give up his desire for the phallic mother and masturbation, his most important organ, the phallus, will be cut off. So to preserve himself, the little boy gives up his first object of love, the phallic mother, the ideal mother, and stops his masturbation or autoeroticism. As no desire gets lost in Freud, This original desire for the phallic mother goes into the unconscious, and in the conscious mind, the little boy identifies with the father and consolidates his masculine subjectivity. The path to feminine identity is more complex, according to Freud. At the beginning of life, during the oral and anal stages, all human beings are bisexual. The little girl is active and masturbates with her clitoris. As she enters the genital stage, the little girl realizes that she's already castrated. So for Freud, there is no such thing as a man and a woman. It's a man and a cut-off man. So, and a little of the phallus, the clitoris, is left. The cause of this undergrowth within the Freudian framework is evolutionary and biological. The girl undergoes a psychical castration complex when she realizes that the phallic mother does not have the phallus either to give her, that the mother like her is also castrated. This makes her turn against her mother. She is disillusioned. There is no such thing as a phallic mother, and everyone whose bodies are like her. She starts to hate her own body and all those who are castrated like her. Moreover, she develops an ambivalent attitude towards the mother. So according to Freud, what is a possibility for the boy, castration, is an accomplished fact for the little girl. She realizes that she does not have the organ of pleasure or life force. This hurts the little girl's narcissism. She undergoes a trauma. She goes to father to get the phallus, who does not give it either. To get the phallus in her body, she tries to please father, takes his beatings, rape, in order to get the desired organ in her body. Because in her mind, according to Freud, it is her own fault. Freud, although an atheist, but he was heavily influenced by his own monotheistic religion, and it's quite obvious in his Moses and monotheism. So for her, it is a sin she committed why she lost her life force organ. When she does not get the organ, she settles for her biological destiny. This involves several things. This is the development of feminine identity in psychoanalytic literature. This involves her transforming the original desire for phallus to a desire for baby from father or father substitute, the transference of the erotic zone from the clitoris to the vagina or the hole, and the substituting of the clitoral activity to vaginal passivity. The vagina in Freudian term is a non-organ, a bloody hole, an open wound that never gets closed and often become infected and secretes pus. We will return to the concepts of the loss of primary narcissism and the open wound shortly. The little girl's original desire, the desire for the phallus, goes into the unconscious as her feminine identity is formed. The unconscious desire of the male is the phallic mother. The conscious one is the identification with father and consolidated male identity. As his phallus is retained, he may get back the primary narcissism and unite with mother in coitus with identities who lack the phallus, a woman. The self or subjectivity is both only when the other, the unconscious, is also born. While the little girl, with the little girl on the other hand, the original desire or the desire for the phallus goes into the unconscious. The desire for the phallus is a feminine desire par excellence. So whoever desires the phallus, even it's embodied male, it's a feminine position. The little girl suffers a double loss, a loss of her primary object of desire, the phallus, and her primary narcissism, object of love, the phallic mother, or the primary unity before the subject-object dichotomy was formed. In Freud and psychoanalysis, normal femininity is thus formed over the death of the primordial unity with the mother. When the little girl discovers her castrated state, she turns against and hates her mother and all women for their loss, which she too suffered. Eventually, she accepts, according to Freud, her biological destiny, converts her desire for the baby for a desire converts her desire for the phallus for a desire for baby from father or father substitute, transfers her erotic zone, and accepts her biological destiny. According to Freud, if she does not accept her biological destiny, then there are two options. She becomes frigid, where she tells herself, since I cannot have as much pleasure as my brother because I'm castrated, I cannot have any pleasure at all. Homosexuality, where where it says that the father has given me the phallus and she pretends she has the phallus. This is a possibility of, so she has the possibility of going back to the primary narcissistic unity in coitus with mother. On this model, the feminine subjectivity is the unfulfilled desire for the phallus, which is covered by the fulfilled desire for the child in Freud. According to Freud, the original desire for the phallus never goes away, and woman never recovers from this trauma or loss of the phallus. This is transformed into other substitutes like the baby and goes as a memory trace in the unconscious. It is a loss or lack that causes the feminine psyche, according to Freud, to be envious, jealous, quarrelsome. In addition, women, according to Freud, have little sense of justice and weak social interest and has not contributed anything to civilization. The only thing which women are good at, according to Freud, is plaiting and weaving, which is a metaphor for her pubic hair, which covers her wound. He actually said that. This is what I think the medical establishment is highly misogynist, apart from being racist, of course. Let us now summarize what we have said about feminine subjectivity. First, Aristotle depicted the feminine identity as the lower level of rationality. Second, liberal feminist model feminine identity on the right, bearing universal abstract male. Then the other of culture and negation, as Simone de Beauvoir and some anthropologists depicted the feminine subjectivity as a lack, that is culture. Although they eventually fell into biologism, none of these theories talked about how the identity indifference or lacking of the feminine evolved as great as in psychoanalysis. With Freud, we saw something different. With Freud, we saw that normal feminine subjectivity is constructed as pathological. So now we are transforming into medicalization, whose very identity or subjectivity is founded on a loss, the loss of the primary narcissism, the absolute unity with the other, which again is due to the lack of phallus. Due to this lack, the feminine subjecthood cannot become a full subject ever. As Melanie Klein, the other analyst, student of Freud, said, the first other happens much before the genital stage. The other is a part object, the mother's breast. That gives infant its support. The child develops envy and frustration when this part object and conceives it along the lines of good versus bad breast, according to Klein. The recognition of this infantile part or part object remains for us throughout our lives and is the basis of seeing the other. Now, there have been research by Sarah Jervis, Teresa Kay, etc., who say that seeing women as body parts. It's very interesting. Objectification theory suggests that bodies of women are reduced to their sexual parts, as well as extensive literature in cognitive psychology suggests that global processing underlies person recognition, local processing underlies object recognition. Integrating these in literature, we introduced and tested the sexual body part recognition bias hypothesis that women's versus men's bodies would be reduced to their sexual body parts. Women are located with part subject, not whole subjects. Thus, the feminine subjectivity is only a part subject and fails to become a whole subject, as in the knowing subject of the Cartesian cogito, Kant's synthetic unity of a perception, or Hegel's theory as the independent self. Let us next see how subsequent theories have interpreted femininity. Of this, the first loss, the phallus, is identified as a lack of a special organ of pleasure. This loss is repressed according to Freud and covered by getting a baby. The second loss is the loss of primary narcissism, the absolute unity with the mother. The first loss or lack of an organ and castration complex is the bedrock of gender identity, as was questioned by subsequent psychoanalysts. According to subsequent psychoanalysts, some of whom were Freud's students, how can anyone have a castration complex if they don't possess the organ? If I don't have $100, I cannot be scared of losing $100. I don't have it. So if she's already lacking, how can she have a castration complex? So did the little girl have an organ that she lost, or she never had it? It was not supposed to be part of her body. In either case, the concept of lack is vague and not clear. So instead of the negative connotation lack, analysts like Marie Bonaparte, Freud's student, said that feminine subjectivity or identity is not a lack, but a different kind of libido, and she calls it masochism. So what creates feminine subjectivity is not the lack or the desire to cover the lack, but the masochistic libido that travels through woman's experience of pain in coitus, pregnancy, childbirth, lactation. The more masochism she adopts in her body, the more feminine she is. Following Bonaparte, analyst Helen Deutsch, also a student of Freud, showed that the masochistic libido is what drives feminine sexuality. Women's life cycle is one of gaining the phallus in her body via coitus, then losing it at the end of. When the little girl discovers her already castrated state, she desires the phallus, and she realizes that father is not going to give it to her, so she settles for a baby. As the masochistic libido circulates in a body, she gets the phallus via coitus, then loses it at the end of coitus, gets the phallus back in childbirth, loses it when the child is born, gets the phallus back in lactation, loses it when it's weaned. So women's time is not linear. Women's time is continuous and cyclic, driven by the masochistic libido, according to Helen Deutsch. When the little girl reconciles with the fact that she will never get the phallus permanently, she settles for her sexual destiny as a mother. So she gives up her initial clitoral activity and gains a new one, pleasure via the pain of coitus, pregnancy, lactation. So according to these women analysts, the more pain she gets, that is her pleasure. So it is and this was used, by the way, in the battered women's movement. This was the masochistic libido. It is the death of her original desire, that is her identity as a mother happens. That is when she becomes her mother, her original clitoral masturbation, the original bisexuality dissolves. So there is no distinction on being a woman and a mother in Deutsch. Feminine subjectivity is not a sole consolidated identity, but relational, embodied, and motherhood. Next comes Joan Rivera. She was a French analyst and also a student of Freud. In fact, she gave refuge to Freud when the Nazi occupation happened in Vienna. Rivera gave a new definition of femininity. She rejected Freud's theory that femininity is a lack. Rivera said femininity is not a lack, but a pretense of lack in order to get by in society. Rivera takes a cue from Ernest Jones, who translated most of Freud's books from German into English. We saw earlier that within Freud, femininity is the lack of phallus, and the desire for the phallus is a feminine desire par excellence. For we only desire what we lack. A normal femininity is one who represses her original desire for the phallus and substitutes her desire for a phallus from father or father substitute, and transfers her erotic zone from the clitoris to the vagina and becomes vaginally passive. If the little girl fails to become the normal feminine, then she had the two other identities, frigidity or homosexuality. Now, according to Ernest Jones, who translated Freud, there are two types of homosexual women, one who retains the subject libido and one who retains the object libido. The type that retains the object libido still desires the other, that is father, but cannot stop complaining about father's injustice or unfairness. Those who retain the subject libido has no desire, for they have incorporated, they think, father's phallus in their body. They enjoy femininity not in the self, but in the other, vicariously as father would do. This is what Joan Rivera took. And Joan Rivera theorizes that femininity is not a lack, but it's a pretense of a lack. Women nowadays are very good at public speaking. They're good at traditional men's job and intellectual skills. These women have taken father's speech or logos, which is traditionally male, and is afraid of father's revenge. They're afraid that they have castrated father and hiding their phallus. To avoid father's revenge, they pretend that they lack the phallus, they hide the phallus, they perform femininity. So we come to performativity. They behave stupidly to boost father's ego. They flirt with father. This is all metaphorical. They perform coquetry so that father would not guess that they have stolen father's phallus. Thus, femininity, according to Rivera, is not a lack, but a pretense of a lack. They possess the phallus, but they pretend they don't. While we have talked about the different interpretations of the lack, the first loss, there is the second loss, the loss of primary narcissism, which is forever. For lacking a phallus, a woman cannot go back to the absolute unity with the mother. The loss of the primary unity is what constitutes femininity. It is a reminder that she does not have a phallus and cannot possess mother as the other, nor can she go back to the absolute unity with mother. For she adopted femininity in her body and thus cannot be in unity with femininity in the other. This loss is what leads to new attribute for femininity. She is melancholic, and it doesn't matter if she's an embodied male. If he's melancholic, he has adopted femininity according to Lucidicere. The feminine subjectivity is not a lack or a desire for the phallus, but a subject whose essence is melancholia, whose loss of the primary narcissism is complete. For she can never go back to the primary unity with mother. It is an open wound. In mourning and melancholia, Freud analyzes melancholia by contrasting it with mourning. The two are very similar. The two have very similar symptoms, and concludes that Freud concludes melancholia is a pathology while mourning is a temporary condition. According to Freud, mourning affects the psyche as a result of loss of love due to death. Melancholia, on the other hand, the object of love need not be dead, but may have withdrawn the love or have slighted, jilted, and abandoned the person. Both melancholia and mourning show the following symptoms: painful dejection, loss of interest in life and love, inhibition of all kinds of action. Moreover, in mourning, the mourner exactly knows what caused his pain and can point to the lost object. In melancholia, one knows what caused it, but not how it is caused. There is something unknown in melancholia that the melancholic cannot name or point her finger at. It is at the root of her psychic discomfort. One further intriguing thing in melancholia in Freud is that the melancholic has an ambivalent attitude towards the lost object of love. There is both love and hate. The melancholic has given up the object of love, but not the love itself. Via the observation of cases in clinical setting, Freud concludes that the mourner can be brought back to a happy and normal state via intense therapy, where the client and the therapist go through the arduous task of recalling memories involving the lost object. Thus, slowly his ego is re-established. In melancholia, the task of reinstating the normal psyche is much more difficult, for it is not a condition but a complex. The most intriguing thing about melancholia is that the melancholic criticizes himself or herself in most severe terms and declares himself as worthless or of no little value. The melancholic also has a desire to be punished for the loss, or she has this criticism and moral overtones towards the self, and suicidal, of course. The melancholic does not critique his own social status or the lack of his material wealth, although he is worried about scarcity. Despite declaring oneself to be worthless and having no value, the melancholic does not treat those around him with respect or humility. In fact, the melancholic flaunts his conditions and relishes the injustice on him. He or she goes on saying how everyone is unjust to them. That is his condition. He enjoys his symptom, his hypochondriac, he relishes his illness. And that is what femininity is, according to the interpretation of Lucidicere in the way Freud shows it. According to Freud, what happens is a split in the ego of the melancholic. She identifies a part of the ego with the lost object and becomes that object. On the other hand, the ego becomes the moral supervisor who critiques that part of the ego that identifies with the lost object. Thus, Freud's analysis of the melancholic is that by critiquing the self he identifies with the lost object, the melancholic is actually critiquing the lost object. In addition, she relishes her illness. She's creating a sense of guilt in the other. Part of the ego is identified and part carries back to sadism, where the melancholic tries to commit suicide. It is when he turns part of himself to the ego and wants to kill that part. According to Freud, the complex of melancholia draws all the libido energy and impoverishes the ego. And in this sense, it is an open wound where all the energy or libido of the melancholic is concentrated on her ego is impoverished. As his narcissism is hurt, the ego wants to identify with the object by devouring it. So in many melancholic, there is an inhibition against taking food. It regresses back to the oral stage, which Freud saw. Sometimes it is a form of hysteria, which is femininity. We have said above, the melancholic cannot point his finger to what is causing the anxiety, the pain, the loss of interest in love and life. The source is not in the conscious mind. For Freud, the source has to be located in the unconscious, where the memory trace of the lost object is located. According to feminist theorists, lucidity within the Freudian and in general the medical model of human identity development, femininity or feminine identity is melancholic and hence pathological. Freud said that after the discovery of her already castrated state, the little girl's primary narcissism is severely hurt. She's traumatized. She realizes that the clitoris is not the organ of pleasure, the source of life, the origin of energy, or the vital force or libido. She leads to the inhibition of sexual activity, passivity, a symptom similar to the inhibition of the melancholic. Like the melancholic, she loses interest in other things for less social interest and outer world. Her vagina is like an open wound which gathers all the energy of her ego and impoverished. She suffers from low self-esteem, which causes her to be envious and jealous. Irigaray said that the most important trauma in the life of the little girl is when she adopts her identity as feminine. She has to give up her primary object of love, the mother and all women. This primary narcissism and the unity of the mother and child cannot be represented in phallocentric language, for it is something beyond language. It is a loss that is unnameable, like the melancholy's reason for pain cannot be pointed out specifically. The little girl does not possess a phallus and can never go back to the primary narcissistic unity with mother in coitus. The trauma of this loss cannot be represented in the phallocentric language, and it remains like an open wound. We saw above that feminine subjectivity goes from historic to pathological, ultimately to the macabre and the horror as an abject, which is what Kristeva says, which is neither a subject. So femininity is neither a subject nor an object, according to Kristeva, but beyond both, one which is primordial and cannot be expressed in language. The self always develops in relation to the other. When there is absolute unity of the self and the other, there cannot be an exchange, for exchange involves dualism and a language. And in this primary unity between the subject and the object, sometimes come out the abject, which is a leftover from the subject. According to Julia Kristeva, an abject is a human reaction, horror, vomit to a threatened breakdown in meaning caused by the distinction between the subject and the object. The primary example is a corpse, which reminds us of mortality. Things like open wound, shit, swage can evoke such reactions. It is something that is placed before the symbolic order and is an absurdity. As Kristeva says, abjection preserves what exists in the anarchism of pre-objectal relationship in the immemorial violence. The object is the primordial repression even before the establishment of the opposition between the conscious and the unconscious. On our individual psychosocial development, the abstract marker, the moment when separated from our mother, we began to recognize a boundary between me and the other. The abject is a precondition of narcissism, which is to say a precondition for the narcissism of the mirror stage, which occurs when we establish this primal distinction. So the abject has to deal with what disturbs identity, system, and order, what does not respect borders, positions, rules, and also can include crimes and the fragility of law. It's a little bit repetition. So I'm skipping to the next part. In our search for the feminine identity, we go from the hysteric to masochistic, melancholic, macabre as the different attributes of the feminine subjectivity. Most of these centered around the loss or the lack of an object, an organ, and sexuality. In the 1950s, French analyst Jacques Lacan showed that Freud's theory is not about sexuality, but about subjectivity and the self. And the most important contribution of Freud was his theory of the unconscious. All subjectivity develops via a loss which goes in the unconscious, and hence is part of the absolute unity of the self and the other. Lacan talks about Freud's fourth dark game. In his Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Freud moved from his initial theory of the pleasure principle to a different theory of subjectivity. Freud saw his grandchild invent a game so that he can deal with the trauma of the loss of his mother when mother is leaving. It is only via the other that the subject gains his subjectivity or sense of self. A child in the early infancy only knows parts of his body with which he identifies himself or herself, like the limb, etc. It's only in the mirror stage, according to Lacan, that the child for the first time sees the subject as a whole, only in the other. The whole identity is a consolidated identity, which is ultimately an illusion. So what feminine subjectivity leads us to, that all subjectivities are ultimately illusions. There is no whole subject. All identities are lacking. The masculine identity does not know that it is lacking the conscious mind, but deep down in the unconscious, he knows, so he imposes the lack on the other, the feminine subject, and says, I don't have subjectivity. So he doesn't accept that, but it's in his unconscious, something haunting him, that it's nothingness. So I impose it on the other. So he says, you don't have subjectivity, but I do. She does not lack, she performs lack. The entire concept of the solid, complete self is nothing but an illusion. Everyone plays a role. And here he Lacan brings in the question of the purloined letter of Edgar Allan Poe, who's sitting at this is a short story by Edgar Allan Poe. He's sitting in his court and the court is in session. The queen gets upset as the messenger brings in her lover's letter. So the minister sees the queen getting upset, and he tries to cover it up by exchanging that letter from the lover with a fake letter. Then another minister sees it and he exchanges that exchanged letter, the fake letter, with another fake. And then another minister sees he's exchanged the second fake letter with the third fake letter. So everything is performative. There is no masculinity, no femininity. This is why there's lacking, everyone is lacking a phallus, an authentic identity. The entire notion of the self is an illusion. It rises, it gets destroyed the next moment. It is actually nothingness. Self is nothing. It's only the other, in relation to the other, that the self rises. That is why feminism is something that cannot be articulated in language, for language is phallocentric. It shows the illusions of all identities. So what inquiry into feminine subjectivity gave us is the illusion of the consolidated self, the Cartesian cogito consynthetic unity of a perception as the continuing self. It's just a creation of language. Whoever says I performs I. Now, this is a department where there are many experts. So with apology to them, I'll revert a little to Eastern philosophy, and my apology to them, maybe I misunderstood this. In a recent book by Ivan Thompson, I read something very interesting comparing Lacan. He says, if I understand correctly, in Yogacara Buddhism, the stored consciousness is an illusion, alaya vijnana, with subliminal repository of psychological propensities and mental consciousness, manovijnana, is the attention of each mental state. Given the presence of simple pre-attentive awareness, it provides a feeling of continuity in consciousness. Given the presence of awareness, when the inner mental awareness attends to a mental state, that state is experienced not as floating freely, but as belonging to the mental stream. When one's mental attention is given to the feeling of happiness, the feeling of happiness is not as belonging to anyone, but as belonging to the same mental stream as does the mental attention to it. From the inside perspective of the mental stream, the happy mental state appears as mine. The pre-attentive mind functions as the base or support of the mental stream's ability to attend to its own state via the inner mental awareness, to be aware of them as mine. The stored consciousness functions as a long-term support for pre-attentive mind. It is the latent disposition that eventually sprouts or manifests one's mental life given the right condition. It ensures the continuity of mental life. It ensures not only that there is a mental continuity across the gaps or breaks in ordinary consciousness, but also that there is mental continuity across the gaps or breaks resulting from certain deep meditative state known as successions. Our search for feminine subject leads us to the subjectivities that are hysteric, confused, masochistic, melancholic, macabre, ultimately as performative and illusory. If so, then what is the role of the feminine subject in resistance? Feminist activism is a politics of resistance. I'll defend that position of the hysteric, melancholic, and macabre before I conclude this paper. The subject has a role to play in social transformation. We saw above that feminine identity, like all identities, is formed via loss. Of this, the second loss is the primary narcissism, jouissance, or absolute unity of the mother. The location of the absolute unity, pre-linguistic and prior to the structured law of the father or the symbolic order. It is a place one's absolute unity with no subject-object dichotomy. The loss of this place is what leads trauma in culture. This is the open wound that leaves its memory in the unconscious and erupts again and again in a cyclic order in a dream when the barrier of the ego is loosened. Freud said that in dream our egos are loosened and then we dream. In his pleasure principle, Freud showed that the child slowly gains his detachment from mother as he substitutes his laws via his fort game. He rolls the ball under the bed and said in German fort, and then when it's coming back, he says da. His loss is substituted by his game. And he goes on doing this over and over again. Similarly, as human species and culture will never overcome the loss of our primary unity with mother. We build culture on the loss, body of that loss, which is like an open wound that erupts time and again. War, ethnic violence, social unrest, inequality, scarcity, poverty, forced migration, partition, and evicted from one's homeland are the manifest content of a culture of which the open wound, the loss of the primary unity, is the latent content. The open wound does not always bleed, but there are times when the open wound bleeds and remedy is needed. There are times when the subject, an illusion or a non-subject, adopts the subject position of the hysteric, the melancholic, and the macabre. When the hysteric, melancholic, and macabre subject is the quintessential, becomes the quintessential feminine subjectivity, the subject of resistance. The journey of the hysteric subject is non-linear. Kristeva says that women's time is non-linear. Even in the highly structured and calm Athenian society, there was an open wound of injustice. Antigone, by her very absurd hysteric being, because she was a product of incest. Her father was actually her sibling and father, and she was born out of a taboo. Her being is a product of incest is itself a transgression and hence an absurdity. The calm rational order of the Athenian society was shaken. When Socrates was falsely accused of subverting the Athenian society, he adopted the hysteric and melancholic subjectivity and questioned the Athenian hospitality. Socrates said that he cannot recognize the Athenian justice system and feels like a foreigner. The rational, hospitable Athenian system has become an open wound that erupted when its law and systems were questioned. Like a hysteric, Socrates said that he felt excluded from the system. Similarly, the hysteric and the macabre identities were assumed by the subject when questioning the rational, right-bearer individual of its own exclusion of the other. The open wound shows itself in the blind belief in rationality to understand and control the laws of nature, power of the new social class, the rising right-bearer bourgeois individual. Thus, the hysteric, the melancholic, the macabre subject formed and questioned the other side of the Enlightenment's euphoria. Like the melancholic who goes through a circular process of abundance of life and depression, the hysteric and the melancholic subject remains calm and dormant, and the open wound bleeds, it erupts against. Contemporary feminism right now has questioned this open wound in two ways. The first one is Shulamit Firestone, who says the root of class, race, gender oppression is the biological family and woman's primary role in reproduction. Since the open wound in our times reveals itself in form of scarcity and poverty, the hysteric subject should adopt the role of destroying the biological family and bringing in artificial reproduction. Firestone envisioned a society where there will be no biological family and no private property, no inheritance. As a result, there will be no class or gender. Everyone will produce artificially and resources will be distributed. There will be no private families and people will live in communes and work as a community. This vision, of course, never worked, for it seems impossible to bring in a revolution in the way she conceived it. Moreover, there is a class of elite who will control the technology. A second kind of hysteric subjectivity demands the introduction of cyborgs. Feminist theories like Donna Haraway conceives of a society where instead of gender binaries, there are cyborgs who are half humans, half machines. We already have artificial intelligence. Modern life is filled with cyborgs. We experience social reality via machines. Our way of growing food, our consumption, our sexuality, reproduction are all mechanized and nothing is natural. The cyborg is a mixture of machine and organism and does not have the castration complex. Like Freud said, in the cyborg, there is no original bisexuality, no alienated labor, no distinction between home and market, does not have to struggle over the meaning of what is private and what is public, the meaning of sexuality, health, politics, and power. In the modern Western society, women and slaves no longer are unfree and lack choices. A lot of social opportunities have opened up. Nonetheless, a new way of creating femininity is evolved in the Western society, particularly in the USA, where masculinity, especially in the welfare system, is constructed as possessive individualism, exchanger of labor in the market, citizen. Femininity is constructed as dependent on public charity, non-working, non-deserving. The state provides for therapies to assimilate those pathological identities into mainstream, because we don't punish anymore, we just pathologize. The first, second, and the third waves are the manic phases of femininity, when the melancholic feminine suddenly get a lot of energy from the patriarchal system as included in the system. Nonetheless, this inclusion is included as the other and as pathologies. Similarly, all subalterns like undocumented people, refugees, low-wage labor, considered pathologies. They're no longer excluded from the polis as Aristotle theorized, but included as others. These identities have alienated life, and unlike Antigone, who was excluded from the polis for her birth, violated the Greek norms as she was born of interest, the fundamental taboo in all cultures. Modern society is filled with taboo around work, home, faith, sexuality, reproduction. The path to end biological reproduction, emancipation through technology is not acceptable to me, since there are no changes in consciousness of people. Similarly, identities such as refugees, undocumented people, working class, war veterans, all happen via process of loss and social exclusion and can never go back to the primary unity, the original desire. On the body of the lost mother, we build civilization by transforming the natural into cultural. The natural earth has to be lost in order for our survival and give back our primary nourishment. Without the loss of the primary attachment, we cannot build our civilization. The solution is not top-down therapy that constructs these identities as pathological, nor the solution to change our evolutionary history via technology. We cannot go back to our primary narcissism and our absolute unity with the mother. But we can build communities across culture and participate in the process of healing. Haraway thinks that building this community is fictional, cannot happen. I, on the other hand, believe that such communities that survive loss and traumatize can recreate their sense of self via collective healing and sharing. Human civilization cannot go back to the primary narcissism, but we can fantasize it or at least mimic it via collective healing. The pandemic has led to a new culture of work from home, and the ideological dimension of the separation of home, oikos, and work, polis, or the market is exposed. Capitalism only values work that has exchange value, while slave labor confined ones in the private. Capitalism incorporates the slave and the woman and other identities only as the other. In advanced capitalism, as the United States, this inclusion is brutal. First, these identities are pathologized, and then they're offered therapy that are top-down and not bottom-up. A safe space is where we can actually talk of our experience not being ridiculed and disbelieved. A safe space is an environment in which everyone feels comfortable expressing themselves and participating fully without the fear of attack, ridicule, abject, melancholic, macabre, or denial of experience. To create this, one wants to develop trust and safety. Together, we can add the more radical theory of brave space. Bravery is needed because learning necessarily involves not merely taking risk, but the pain of giving up a formal condition in favor of a new way of seeing things. Feminist methodologies of consciousness raising includes all of this. First, women spoke in safe spaces, then they built collective trust to speak in brave spaces. First, when marginalized groups slowly come face to face with the marginalization, what is needed is collective healing for true inclusion that does not mimic the older system of othering. Collective healing is probably starting in the margins. Here we see the first glimmer of a truly inclusive polis. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for your really comprehensive and thought-provoking talk. Now the floor is open for discussion. You all can ask your questions.
Can I ask something?
Yes, sir. Please go ahead.
Good afternoon. Pleasure to see such learned people together. I don't know about the background of the speaker, but I really would like, again, to say that when you are discussing issues like the question of subjectivity and subject-centeredness and the nature of the moral agent, also the epistemic agent, with reference to the history of philosophers, I think we need to be a little more careful. And I really once again like to call your attention to the methodology that is being used in the paper. Sometimes the difficulty is that the people who are being quoted, like Freud and others, are empirical investigative scientists who are using investigative method, in which we all know that the data is very insufficient and the interpretation is hugely imaginative based upon their own understanding and their own cultural locatedness. The second question is that if you are trying to look at the nature of the subject as the epistemic subject in case of Kant, the epistemic subject is a thin Kantian unity, the transcendental unity of a perception. It is completely genderless, and to call it male-centric is, I think, a huge part of imaginative reconstruction. Similarly, in the case of the Cartesian cogito, we need to understand that, again, it has been abstracted out of a cultural context, and Descartes is only methodologically for a temporary while trying to say that, you know, this is the first thing that you are trying to establish. The whole discussion that you find in Simon and Freud and the others are largely located in the social context in which they are living. And in that also, if you look at Freud's own understanding that he got evidences from Anna and the other person about personal anecdotes, even on the scientific grounds, it is highly improbable. Therefore, I'd like to say that, you know, when you're talking about the epistemic subject and the moral subject from the historical perspective, we all go back to Aristotle, and Aristotle is essentially talking about the capacity of the individual to transcend the context and think about others and also think about good in general. And that he generally describes as what he calls a political competence. And he makes a very important relationship between knowing, doing, and making. Now, all that context is completely lost out in this huge kind of discussion which these people are doing, with a huge amount of excessive anatomical description, which can hardly be explained in terms of any practical experimental science. Where do they get the data of girls having a phallic concept, where in many cases we have found in India and in many tribal societies, the girls have actually never seen the male body, even up to the up to the age of their marriage. So how do they get this kind of a complex? The idea of the divine father, etc., is a usually Christian kind of a concept which is not available in other contexts. So the whole theorization, as well as the empirical data and its interpretation, is largely imaginative. And I think right now we need to first keep two questions separate. One, where are they getting their philosophical bearings? Two, where are they getting empirical bearings? And on both, I think there is much which needs to be redone, despite the fact that we have been so often used to reasoning these things again and again and again and again in all our feminist study classes. But I think as independent scholars, we need to retest that, because now is a time for reassertion of our intelligence.
May I kind of intervene here if I have been put in the chair? I am imagining that I have a certain duty here. So may I respond, Rahul?
Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Yes, actually I'm at a disadvantage not being there in person, Listening in on the proceedings from a distance online is a little bit of a something that throws me off. In any case, I just wished very briefly to respond to Professor Rakesh Chandra's observations. And I just wanted to say that the speaker is situating her understanding of psychoanalytical methods as vis-a-vis feminism against the backdrop of what great disservice the idea of subjectivities that you find in Descartes or Aristotle or Hegel or Kant has done to feminist concerns. And I think that is why her understanding of how they constructed the ego or the subject or the feminine subject has helped the structures of domination and subjugation to become more and more entrenched in academic thought, at least. So you can excuse her for that, because...
Sir, you're not audible. Professor Rakesh Chandra, sir, you're not audible.
Yeah, can I? Professor Kuller, I think, we are so used to repeating what we have read. And what I'm only trying to ask are two questions. One, the relationship of theory to, and that is why I called attention to Aristotle's understanding of relationship of theoria with poiesis and praxis and phronesis. That how does the theoretical understanding actually lead to the others? Now, if the assumption is that a theoretical understanding of the subject and then a feminized subject is the reason for the Western construction of the male as the dominant, etc., one, I think it needs to be investigated. Once you investigate it, and particularly the standard villain that we generally quote are people like Descartes and people like Kant. And there I want to say that, they can plead not guilty. The answer is that when you are talking about Descartes, in the discourse on method, in the very first section, he talks about a very cultured nature of the self and talks about different societies in different parts of the world in different times having different modes of ethical behavior, which he says are equally acceptable, and maybe the people whom we consider to be barbarians are actually not morally reprehensible at all. It is in that context that he finally says, but when I am trying to find some kind of a certitude and build up a certain kind of an epistemic edifice, what kind of an epistemic subject do I require? Then let me try and find that out. And for that, he devises that. So he's very conscious of the variety, very Catholic and tolerant about that. Please, everybody needs to read the first and the second chapter of the Discourse on Method, which they have not. And the moment you come to the third, he's trying to only call attention to the epistemic subject as the thin knower, and that too it gets the veracity from the principle of doubt, which gets its veracity from God. So in case of Descartes, it's quite clear. I don't know how they get this theory, and they keep on doing that. In case of Kant, again, his writing on theory and practice, his writings on women are atrocious. I find them extremely obnoxious. He says that women will always be passive citizens, they do not will, etc., etc. All of that is very fine. But when you are talking about subjecthood in Kant, the epistemic subject is actually only the transcendental unity of a perception, which is hardly even embodied. So there to accuse him there is actually barking the wrong tree. Similarly, if you're then starting saying that, okay, no, now Freud comes to the scene and he starts doing his thing. Now, Freud as a psychoanalyst is an empirical scientist who's actually trained in neuroscience. He needs to do all his investigation based upon empirical data, and then use a certain kind of thing of that, what is the frozen data and what is the data that he has taken for reference. The data that he has taken both for men and women is frightfully small, number one. Number two, the kind of imaginative reconstruction that he does is entirely based upon his own idea of how women feel, etc. So they hardly, you find rarely any kind of, and even if the interview that you find is so small. And that is where I was saying that, the phallic envy, the whole kind of a story which has actually been more savored for its titillating value by the male reader over the years, has actually been largely based upon his own interpretation. The fact is, as I mentioned, I worked with the women's movement and with actual women for years together, both in rural and urban India. And I want to tell you, share this at least. I know for a fact, even urban girls getting married without actually ever seeing the male anatomy. So they have a phallic envy and blah, 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 can only be understood in a certain kind of a metaphoric way, that there is a lack. But the graphic anatomical detail in which he goes on, and with the speaker also, I think, gave in great graphic detail, which I think almost bordered on, I don't know what, is actually where it needs to be re-looked at. The huge biologism encrusted in this kind of a theory, the huge essentialism as well as ethnocentrism encrusted in this kind of a theory needs to be questioned.
I found you a little squeamish, Professor Chandra, but however, I'll keep my peace here. So may I then request Professor Majumdar to...
Yes, that's why Freud was completely reinvented bottom up. I don't know if he was really Freud anymore, by Jacques Lacan, who ultimately said that it's subjectivity, the whole thing is an illusion. One thing that I didn't read here because I was running out of time, it's too long, is a reinterpretation of a trilogy, The Loss of the Mother, the melancholic subject, Ashapurna Devi, the Bengali novelist, when the mother actually left, because this is the 19th century or the early 20th century, she left the family and she actually came to Kashi. She left the family because she was mad with the father for marrying her off at 9. And the relationship between the absent mother and Subharnalata, the daughter, who was also very revolting in her in-law's house, that was a melancholic relation. It's the death of the mother that gave her that feminine subjectivity. It's the loss of that mother. If her mother was there, she probably would not have had. I didn't read that because it was going on and on. I wanted to give the break so that people don't get too confused. Lacan completely reinvented, said we are not reading Freud. I mean, postmodernism, people can read text in any way, but we don't read Freud in the way that he should be read. Maybe Freud was a biological determinist, but his intention was subjectivity. He was talking about the subjectivity, and his most important contribution is the unconscious. So probably the mother is the unconscious of, the entire culture, the loss of the mother. Our subjectivity has to be in a negation in that loss. So if we read Lacan, then Freud is a completely different Freud from the biological determinism. And he comes closer, I think. Then Freud actually goes beyond that universal cogito or whatever. And with Aristotle, whatever he said, his actual politics, he was talking about that abstract. The same with the 19th century European liberalists. They were talking about the abstract right of the abstract individual, but in reality, the discrimination happened embodied, which is why people who are marginalized are partly observed. And this is psychologically proven. We don't observe them as a whole, but only as a part. So only in their own position, either they're dark or they're short or they're fat or some disability. See, when we see people with disability, that person who is on wheelchair. That's how we see people. That's an individual. So Lacan, I think, completely changed Freud in that sense. So Freud read before reading Lacan. And then when I read Lacan, Freud took the whole Hegelian thing and then Kojève's interpretation of Hegel and did the Freudian thing. I don't know if that answered the question, but one can read Freud non-biologically. And with that phallus, not seeing the phallus, I think for Freud's answer would be it's more instinctual, it's more subjectivity, someone's giving more importance than me. I mean, that's how our subjectivities rise, that I'm not getting as much importance, if we read Freud in the postmodern way.
I mean, this conversation can go on a bit further because I can see Professor Chandra would have something on comeback. But Rahul, if you allow me, then we should have other questions also come in at this point.
Yes, ma'am, you can go ahead inviting questions from the people who are connected through online, and then there are some people who wanted to ask questions here who are present. So then I'll let you
Yes.
know.
So you and I can share this responsibility of inviting the questions. The first question I saw from Mr. Abhay, if I'm not mistaken, is a question that he would have asked about a difference of approach between Freud and Jung. For Freud, women were the problem. He thought of them as inherently opposing change, being passive, being melancholic, or whatever. But what exactly did Freud, how exactly did he interpret the feminist trajectory of the Oedipal complex and the whole idea of totemism and taboo that Professor Majumdar was talking about? She could explain that a little further. The person who has raised this question would also like to know how Jungian idea of the feminist anima being one of the archetypal qualities, and the difference between anima and animus, how that compares with the Freudian idea of feminine subjectivity, if I interpret the question correctly. Professor Majumdar, would you like to take that on?
Thank you. Actually, in the whole 1920s, as I said, there was a whole debate within the psychoanalytic community around Freud. How exactly the question that Professor Chandra, I think he raised, how can a woman, how can I have a castration complex when I don't have a phallus? How can I be scared of losing $100 when I don't have $100? So it's a really weird thing. And Jung, I think, kind of tried to overcome it by also talking about the collective unconscious. He went a little bit into the culture more than the biology from Freud. And the anima, it's very interesting that this was brought in. I'm connected to the Psychoanalytic Society of India, IPS, and it was established by Girin Shekhar Bose. His brother is Rajshekar Bose, who translated the Mahabharata from Sanskrit into Bengali. It's so sad. And I'm taking those letters, and I hope they'll sometimes be published and we get an apology from Vienna. Actually, Girin Shekhar Bose, he wrote to Freud in correspondence in 1920s. He wrote that, from what I understand in our philosophy, in our Bharatiya philosophy, there are always opposing desires, love, hate together. It's not binary like you say. Freud took that. He actually talked to psychoanalytic societies with these people that I mentioned, Deutsch and Karen Horney, I didn't speak, Melanie Klein and others. And then they said that, yes, it's continuous, the binary, continuous. And then it's because of that letter, a whole new idea sprung into the whole concept of his first bisexuality sprung. There's not one place where he acknowledged that. So I would consider it plagiarism. And Jung, this anima, I never read that, but I'm hypothesizing. I hope I'm wrong. I think he too plagiarized it because he was part of that psychoanalytic. Maybe I'm wrong. With that anima, when Girin Shekhar Bose wrote that, he was a psychiatrist and then he did his MS in psychology and he corresponded regularly with Freud. He said, in our philosophy, it's not that opposition. A person can love, hate the same. This ambivalent that I'm talking about in melancholia. He took that, and then Freud's, I don't know, I hope, I want to do that research and bring that out. And if that is true, then Viennese Psychical Society, they owe us an apology. So yes, so Jung's much more non-biological, I think, much more cultural. But then Freud's Moses and monotheism, for which he was thrown out by the Jewish community. Was he that much biological, really? He was also talking about culture. So it's very hard to read these people. And by the way, I'm not against Kant or René Descartes, but this whole pretense of the universal subject, that needs to be interrogated. So that's my answer. I'm sorry I went round.
Rahul, can you go ahead and ask the question of the audience?
Yes, and there are some people who want to ask. Now, I have a Dr. Pramod Bagre who want to ask some question from you. Yeah, please come here, sir.
First of all, congratulations on such an illuminating lecture. But what would I like to question is this Freudian conception of subjectivity as pathology, how does this bear upon the politics of women's emancipation, the politics of redistribution? Because the entire discourse of postmodern feminism emphasizes on politics of culture recognition to the exclusion of politics of redistribution. What is your response?
Thank you, excellent. And Professor Kullar might be able to say this much more than I do. She deals with the justice system and law. I have a feeling, living in the US for 30 years, they're no longer going to be prisons. It's all going to be mental hospitals. Because it's not just femininity. There is a tendency nowadays also in India to pathologize, but anyone who's outside the norm, hysteric. Antigone was hysteric. Why? Because she wanted to bury her father's sibling. First of all, her birth itself was a transgression. She was a product of incest. This is Sophocles' play. And then she protested against the calm Athenian society. So that society was definitely not calm. Nietzsche also said that these people go and watch tragedies. Why do they watch so much tragedies if everything was fine? There must be something. So frankly, with pathology, I really don't know where the Western society is going. I think in Sweden, see, I'm very much against, I'll be to be very frank. I'm very much against the death penalty, even for rapists, because the death penalty is the state instituted thing. And there is someone expert there, Professor Kulla, so I'm not going to talk about it. Because in the US, what I've seen is when white women get raped, it's all over the media. But native women in New Mexico, where I stay, it's a very colonized place. That's where the indigenous people lived, Native Americans. That every single day women are abused, raped, missing. Where is the justice system there? So if you have to give the death penalty, give it to everyone. The states, at least our democratic states, I don't know about other nations. I've never lived in North Korea, so I don't know. We have to be just. But that's another thing. The thing is that pathology, I will leave it to the audience, is what our justice system has better, or if we are all victims, oh poor thing, what could he do? He raped because he was abused as a child. So pathologize. Pathologize has two parts, of course. Women were always pathologized, but other people, marginalized people, people who have no language, people who can't speak, pathology is a big thing. And also it's very much connected to the huge medical industry, like profit-making industry. The prisons make a lot of money. The psychologists making money. I'm reluctant to say this because we have an expert here. So that's why. But I don't know if I answered your question. That's pathology, where it's taking us. Women were always pathologized. But see, with Aristotle, I find it very interesting. Greek women had confused rationality, but slave women were no different from other slaves. They had no rationality. So it's only a certain, even Engels said that. Engels in his Family Private Property said that's upper class women who had this whole pathology. So I don't know, it's this whole pathological, I hope our medical establishment, I mean, healing, isn't that much better? Isn't that what our medical science is? Instead of this corporate driven, it's a push medicine, continuous, the pathology, this therapy, they're making huge money from that. So that's, again, I don't know if I answered it.
Since you did bring up the question of justice, I just want to make one small little comment that feminists themselves are against the Freudian theories for their presumptions of what women are, that they are given to melancholy, they have penis envy, and they are passive and have an inability to negotiate their own subjective their own identities and so on. But there is a section of feminists, especially those feminists who believe in what is called care ethics, are now opposing the whole idea of justice itself, that it is a construct based on abstract rational principles, whereas for women, justice cannot be defined in terms of this uniform behind a veil of ignorance kind of principles, that justice must equate with women's responsibilities, with women's idea of care and concern and caregiving to others, that women are different kind of people and they are also part of society. So the principles of justice, the so-called Rawlsian principles of justice, cannot possibly be principles of a just society. And I think that's one of the major things that feminists have against Rawls, at least one section of feminists.
Hello. So is there anyone who wants to ask a question? I think you wanted to ask. Yeah, please come.
Good afternoon. I'm Florence Minch. After listening the lecture, it was a good lecture, and gathering some information as you presented from the beginning till end, what I found is that you tried to explain about the Greek who thought that women had confused rationality and all that. In that, you stated that probably state was unfavorable towards feminism, towards women. Yeah. So how far later on feminism itself has worked on that? What are the ways, like you were trying to give one approach, like psychoanalysis taking from the idea of Freudian. This is one perspective, but this seems to be problem is of state, polity, but we're trying to find a biological or some called psychological analysis. That's the little contradicting point I found, where there are some philosophers, feminine philosophers, who have tried to address the problem. If the feminism was unfavorable, or state was unfavorable towards feminism, have they worked on that idea? Any philosophers?
The first wave is assimilative. Why it failed? It was pro-state. The state give us the right, then we'll be free. So slaves were freed and so forth. But eventually feminism is opposed to the state because the state is the highest power. And feminism is opposed. That's the phallocentrism. So feminism can... Antigone stood against the entire Athenian state to bury his father, slavery, because that was the greatest transgression. And Socrates, actually, I think my reading, please, I apologize if my reading is wrong. In his apology, in his last lectures on hospitality, which Derrida recounted, there are two types of hospitalities. One is conditional hospitality, where someone has a document and they are legal citizen of another nation. And then I give them document here. Something is an unconditional hospitality, where they're stateless people, refugees, they have nowhere to go. And we have seen that, right? I always say that the open wound in our subcontinent is the partition, because my forefathers are, that's where they're from Bangladesh originally, but they couldn't stay there. So they're basically thrown out. So that's our open wound. Now, with Socrates adopted that anti-state hysteric positionality when he's saying, what have I done? I don't understand this Athenian state. I thought it was hospitable to everyone. It was cosmopolitan. And now they're saying I'm against the state, I'm corrupting the youth, and I am against the gods of the state, and I've declared so and so and so. That's his whole thing. So the hysteric position, I think in the end I mentioned, it's that oppositional position. Feminism, I think, can never be pro-state, because that's the phallocentric. Wherever there's position of power, it has to be against that power. But then again, Professor Kulla, that's... she talks about laws and justice, so I'll also let her speak.
Ma'am, would you like to take up some questions from online audience?
Yes, there is one question by Mr. Kamlesh Yadav. I could read the question, but
May I ask the question? I have mentioned some comments and needed some remarks of Professor Majumdar. Could I
yes,
vocalize my remarks?
please identify yourself.
Hello. This is Abhinav Tiwari. Sorry, ma'am. Actually, I'm on the journey, so I had to mention the question in comment box. Am I audible to you?
Yeah, you are audible. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Professor. Actually, your lecture is very enlightening. Let me read out my comments. Irrespective of psychoanalytic take on feminism, while cogitating over the dynamism of subjective experience, particularly the self and the identity in difference, Freud seemingly drifted the notion of sexuality by taking the recourse to the psychosociological praxis within the structural frame of gender identity, rather than being relied on the socially and unconscious pattern. Because the archetypes of femininity depicts the integration of primordial psyche. Because if we take the recourse to the Jungian analysis, we find that feminine archetypes have several dichotomy, but not subject-object libido, in the dearth of feeling power and lack of phallus, because Freud made a bifurcation analysis while centralizing the phallus as the symbol of power, which segregates the self in the sociological praxis as male and female, depicted and designed in certain way, are made or formed or conceptualized or categorized in a specific way. Because I'm much more interested in primordial psyche or the archetypical nature of femininity and the masculinity as well. So I need your remarks, particularly by taking the recourse to the Jungian psychology and his concept of archetypes. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Freud was 100% dictator in some way. He actually threw out Jung when Jung took his theories and made it cultural, said that it's not biological, it's cultural. The oppositional binary, which was going on, wasn't it, for a while in Western philosophy with Hegel's the recognition of the other and so forth. He kind of brought in the master-slave dialectics and so forth. And then it was taken up. He actually goes beyond that archetype. Now, does that address, your question was that address the feminist concerns? See, if you are a Julia Kristeva, you said it will no, you'll say it is no, because the feminine subject is neither the subject nor the object, but the abject, the horror, the macabre, which evolves from time to time. When there is an open wound, it comes up and then it disseminates, and then it comes up again and it goes back. Because again, they showed that women's time is driven by the masochistic libido. This is all explained by these analysts. And therefore it's cyclic. You're losing it. I think the first wave feminist movement, which is pro-state, give us the right to vote, that's a phallocentric movement, actually. And then it has an open wound. The open wound at that time is we don't have the right to vote, we don't have the right to work. But there are aporias in that open wound. The open wound also is not perfect. So cyclically it broke down the first wave. Then came the second wave, the politicization of the private. Its open wound is always the other, the colonized space. They never talk about women of color, black women, slavery, they didn't do that. Then the open wound came back again in the third wave. When people in different cultures are rising, then the open wound is going to come back over and over again. And I don't know how helpful his theory is to feminism, but he is also in that binary mode. If you take really the French feminists like Kristeva and other psychoanalysts, you will see that the abject is actually beyond the subject and object, because the primary narcissism is the underlying basis which cannot be represented. Even the Hegelian object can be represented in language, right? And that's why the slave becomes the master in the next dialectical moment.
Actually, ma'am, here is one thing. And if we take the recourse to the open wound, particularly, then we have to think that particularly the embodiment of Kali, the goddess Kali, as we find her as an embodiment and the complete manifestation of power, Shakti, as we worship in India, the Shakti, then that would be a different conception and consideration, because that would be the denial of power praxis and that would be a different take as a reaction to the feminism, because we think that that reaction was completely against of injustice rather than a reaction to the strong feminism. Thank you. Need your remarks, ma'am. Thank you. You are very enlightening, professor. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. And I'm starting to read, I was telling Dr. Mishra about this whole thing, that I'm starting to read Tantra and our feminine. I think that there's these concepts at the whole point of time. I mean, time is so colonial. We celebrate New Year and so forth. That's colonial.
That's right. That's
Aztec
right.
culture, yes. The Aztec culture all along Mexico. I live in the border. It's Mexico-US border. All along, they've destroyed their calendar. So they've destroyed our calendars also. That's all cyclic time. Definitely the open wound, and you brought in Kala. I'm looking into it. I have to say my knowledge of Indian philosophy is limited. So that's why I trepidly brought in the Buddhism, the Yogacara Buddhism, which I'm reading right now, and Lacan, the illusion of the subjectivity, the stream of consciousness and its momentary existence.
So much, ma'am. Thank you so much. Wish you the best, ma'am.
Yeah. Ma'am, you're not audible, Professor Kullar.
There is a question from Mr. Kamlesh Yadav. If I'm allowed to summarize it, his question is, if one accepts this total biological determinism of Freud, then how can one overcome it? If it is a given fact, and if we are biologically determined to be incomplete and ineffectual in shaping a world of our own, then how are women going to negotiate? Because let's understand that the main feminist concern is to not to interpret the world the way it is, but to change it, to bring about transformation, to make an intervention that will make actual valid changes to the way the world has been shaped. So how do we overcome it? And I think Professor Majumdar did talk about Shulamit and how she talks about a revolution through technology, where there won't be a biological family, but that families will be built through, say, IVF or some kind of other technological device, which will take away this whole idea of father and mother. And also she speaks about Donna Haraway's suggestion of cyborgs, and how being part machine and part human, you are not really biologically determined in the manner in which Freud would have wanted us to believe. So you have to lose the natural earth, I suppose that's what she said, to create a sense of self, to take part in what is called collective healing. So, but would Professor Majumdar also like to respond to this question?
Yes, what Professor Kulla says is exactly true, that there have been several feminists, and there's a sort is growing a little bit on the Firestone line. I'm not very pro. Didn't Plato at the end of his Republic say the state has to take control of the eugenics of people? The state has to determine reproduction. I'm very scared of that. So I also don't like very much Firestones. It looks Stalinism to me. I mean, taking control of people's reproduction. Exactly what Professor Kulla said, Firestone and Haraway. They did say we don't have to be settled for our biological destiny with our new biotech and whatever. It's my personal thing. I don't like it because the vision of Plato's last republic comes to my mind, and I'm not particularly fond of it. Neither of us Stalin, because the Russians, from what I understand, they did a lot of work on eugenics and cybernetics. So racially and otherwise, what will happen to people who are handicapped and disabled? So we'll clean them off through eugenics. We won't let them be born. But I'm very pro-choice. It's a woman's choice whether not to have a, she can, the state has no right to control that. That's not the issue here. The issue here is, where do we stop our eugenics, that perfect society of. So yes, what she said is exactly what I would have said, that these two feminists and others, sci-fi feminists, the sci-fi feminists, they're more talking about that cyborgian type of thing. That's my personal choice. I'm not very fond of those.
Yes, but if someone were to ask you a personal question as to how would women, the modern woman, address the factors that trap women into these gendered positions, I mean, not taking any of the suggestions given by the cybernetics, what are women to do to overcome something that they are biologically doomed to, if one takes psychoanalytic theory?
I think that whole social support, gender roles are cultural. We can do it through cultural transformation and change. And I'm not completely opposed to the technological. We do use birth control and other methods. We have those in our system, but I would prefer more support, a lot more support from the state. Well, again, as I said at the end, that yes, the state does give a lot of support in the US, welfare mothers, but they are pathologized. They have to be on therapy continuously. They won't get their welfare check if they don't go to therapy. They have to reveal the paternity of each child, which is so humiliating. Yes, they're getting their checks. They're getting a house which is not too good to live in, but they have to reveal their paternity, not to the private patriarchy, but to the public patriarchy vis-a-vis the state. So that is very humiliating, each paternity of each child. So if we get a lot more social support, I think it's possible. It's possible for women to overcome some of their biological destinies of Freud.
Yes, Rahul, I don't see any other questions on the chat box.
I think I have Dr. Rajiv Lochan Behra here, who is teaching philosophy here in the department, would like to ask one question.
Let us thank to the speaker because of her thought-provoking and informative talk. Before asking some question, I want to dismiss his thesis, feminism. As you know that feminism is something man-woman dichotomy, what I understood. That should not happen if we, the human, need for our sustainability and need the relation with divinity. Otherwise, whatever is happening, that's not the issue of discussion or philosophy. And the month's title itself also, the one part is contradict to the another part in certain sense, that psychoanalysis and feminism. We can say psychoanalysis is a kind of source of the thesis feminism, and also its psychoanalysis is also an weapon of the thesis, what dismiss the thesis of feminism in the sense very basically we are noticing or highlighting certain reasons behind this thesis, something subdivision of subjectivity, ego, and something called sorry, yes, something called, yeah, biological diversity. So these are the very fundamental reasons behind this thesis. So I think the category of feminists, they are thinking it's a very useful thesis for human sagacity, philosophic sagacity, but I don't think so, because they are losing their original position as a being, human being. So I want to refer to the codes biological diversity. In that case, what they think? They think through the lens of gender, but they forget that they are human in the ground of ethics or morality. They should have some harmony for the societal integration. And secondly, they noticed or they highlighted the issue that is ego. Ego is also the cause. In that case, the dichotomy, man-woman dichotomy, is not so stable, because here I found ego is something very much similar to ignorance. So, as a human, we are the seeker of knowledge, and the thesis itself also provides some knowledge. But in that ground, perhaps they are something going in a very narrow sense, in a narrow way, which way they are themselves. That means the individual alone is going, but knowledge cannot be produced by anyone else. It needs some debate and dialogue. What ma'am also already started, that means already highlighted Socrates' philosophy. So in that ground, it is also contradictory to itself. And the next ground, subdivision of subjectivity. In that case, the problem rises between man and man-woman disharmony. Here, I think it is something, the lack of societal integration of humanity. They're losing the fundamental entity of the being who are they. And my query is that, do we consider one is subject and another one is not subject? Is that object? If this is the case, if a man consider the woman is object, and then woman consider the man is object, I think it's very common for us. It's a genuine problem, because both man and woman, in between there is object, just because of the biasness of object, or something we can say the impression of object. That is why perhaps this dichotomy. But it's also not a strong evidence in order to consider or in order to continue the doctrine what feminism is about. So thank you, ma'am.
What I find very fascinating is this inquiry into subjectivity, whether it's through psychoanalysis or philosophy, ultimately leads us to the point where the subject is an illusion. The same thing, yes. That's where probably it's, see, patriarchy not only oppresses women, it oppresses everyone, right? It oppresses every single person with every single role. It oppresses people in one way in tribal cultures, in one way in feudal cultures, and in another way in capitalist cultures, and probably another way in socialist cultures, although I've not lived in Cuba or whatever, so I don't know. So ultimately the subject object, it's not my taking a position of subjectivity, but my taking the position of the hysteria, because a subject position cannot remain empty. It filled up. Gayatri Spivak said that it fills up with some subject effect, whether it's history, hysteria. The open womb is going to come out with war, scarcity, and that's when the subject position is occupied by some subject position. And it's probably cyclic. It's not linear. We don't know that. We don't know about time. And so subject object is, yes, in the finer line, but I find it very interesting. It's not till postmodernism that Western philosophy, like philosophers like Derrida and Lacan, they destroyed both subject and object. It's the illusion of the whole thing. So that's, this is such a complex question. We can go on and on forever, but yes.
Hello. I think we don't have questions here, ma'am, and I think you have also gone over all the questions online. So, okay, I think Rajan's question is, Rajan, are you there? Rajan? You're not audible, Rajan. Can you unmute yourself? Hello? I think he has some problem with his mic. Okay, ma'am, I think Rajan has left his question here in the chat box. He asked, they have already been declared as pseudo-scientists, referring to Freud. That's what I think he had to ask. He's saying that Freud is being considered as pseudo-scientist. Would you like to have your response? Yeah.
Freud went to be trained as a hypnotist and he turned out very bad by Cherchon. Then he came back in Vienna and then he started his practice. And then these women used to come and talk about their childhood traumas. The memories, traumas always remain memories. And he used to note them down. Then when he went and read the whole thing in the Viennese Psychical Society, they said that he was, this is all rubbish. And we don't believe all this. This is someone's fantasy. That's when he came up with a theory that rape is both a woman's fantasy because the desire for the phallus is the feminine desire per excellence. So whether Freud is a pseudoscientist, maybe he is, his biological determinist, but he did do a sort of a Copernican revolution. He did give us, even if it's wrong, some sort of a theory of human development. Because people never thought that children had sexuality. That's why he got so much into trouble with his own Jewish community, because the whole point of the innocent child is not there. We're born with sexuality. We have a desire towards, whether it's the part object, the mother's breast, which gives us nourishment. Even the baby wants to live. That libido is there. But of course, later his students said, no, there's a masochistic libido. Otherwise, why people do commit suicide, right? Although Kant said it's one of the absolute duties not to preserve yourself, not to commit suicide. But was Kant universal, or was he his own Protestant Judeo-Christian thinking? That was one of his absolute duties, to self-preserve people. And that's why suicide is considered irrational. But Freud, despite his libido of the instinct, the life force, when he saw the war and he was thrown out of Vienna because of his Jewish heritage, he went to England. He wrote his Beyond the Pleasure Principle, from which I quoted. He said, we do have a death instinct. Actually, I didn't support Firestone so much, but wouldn't it be nice if we could choose our time of death like Bhishma? We all choose our. Sometimes I have these fantasies, but.
So would you agree with the question that Freud was a pseudo-scientist?
See, I will be agnostic. I will not answer that question. Okay. That's his trajectory. He changed his whole story. These are anecdotes, fantasies of women. But first, he didn't. He did record this. Now, whether he was a pseudoscientist, as I said, I don't know. Well, is Copernicus still right? Is Galileo wrong? We deal with philosophy. We know epistemology. I mean, sciences, conjectures and refutations. Probably he was.
All right.
Okay, I think now we are over with the questions. So, ma'am, would you like to make your some remarks as a chair?
Which ma'am?
Professor Kulla, ma'am, I'm just asking to you.
All right.
Yeah.
Yes, I suppose being on the chair, I think everything that needed to be said from the from Professor Majumdar's side has actually been said, and the gaps have been filled in by the way she has responded to the questions. There were some questions that all of us, I think, began with when we entered into the room to listen to Professor Majumdar. The first was perhaps what happens to the sex gender distinction, and I think she answered it by explaining how for Freud the sex identity is not a given in nature, it is an acquired and achieved identity. And she goes on to explain about how this identity is developed, the sexed identity, through Aristotle and through others as well. Another question that came up was, how does one understand the manner in which Freud constitutes the ego, constitutes the subject? And Professor Majumdar did very well to explain to us from Aristotle to Descartes and Hegel and to Beauvoir, and then, of course, to Freud, how the self is constituted differently for men and for women. A third question that came to mind was a difference between Freud and Jung and their approaches to psychoanalysis vis-a-vis feminism. And in her response to one of the questions, I think Professor Majumdar made it amply clear what kind of difference is relevant to these discussions. A fourth question that we began with was, how do women negotiate the factors that trap women into their gendered positions if one were to take the psychoanalytic approach of Freud, which is biologically deterministic? And Professor Majumdar did indicate some of the feminists who have quite radical opinions about what can be done by women. Professor Majumdar doesn't seem to agree totally, but she has her own opinions as well. One last question that entered into my mind, and perhaps in the going out, just before going, she can touch upon it, was a distinction that I'm a little confused about between psychoanalytic feminism and feminist psychoanalysis. But apart from that, I would like to take this opportunity to congratulate Professor Majumdar on on speaking so engagingly on a subject that is extremely intricate, and not many of us are very well read on the huge amount of literature that goes behind it, but she has opened the doors for us. And thank you so much for giving us a glimpse into psychoanalytic theory and feminist concerns with psychoanalytic theory. Thank you so much, Professor Majumdar, and congratulations once again. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, ma'am, for your concluding remarks. Now I would like to invite Dr. Priyanka Mishra for proposing vote of thanks.
Namaste, everyone, and I'm Priyanka Mishra, and I'm here to present the vote of thanks on behalf of Department of Philosophy and Religion, Banaras Hindu University. First of all, a big thank you to you, ma'am, for gracing this occasion and engaging and filling our mind with such great ideas. And I think this topic is very close to my heart, and I'm also very interested. And I think your talk, this talk must have, because I have seen that, when we ask our students to work on such issues, they just they don't agree, and they think that they don't get motivated. I think after this talk, they will get some motivation to work on these areas. And of course, when you talk about feminism, I always feel that when you talk about women or about their rights or something, no, so people some sort of question when you which you face, like, are you a feminist or something, like, so you just back off, and you say that don't put me in a box, and then suddenly so you realize it that it's a kind of fear of judgment, which we all face. So something that I think this topic was also very it was still untouched in our lecture series. So I think please accept my sincere thanks, and it was really very enlightening. And now I would like to thank Professor Ruprekha Khullar. Thank you so much, ma'am, for your profound remarks. And I think ma'am has answered so well, and she has because the grace it's the kind of she has shared her opinion with us, and very gracefully, and she has made this seminar very meaningful and productive. Thank you so much, ma'am, for being with us today. And next, I would like to extend my gratitude to our head of the department for his constant support and rejuvenating our academic pursuit in this department. Thank you so much, sir. And next, I would like to thank all the faculty members from our department and other universities as well for their active participations and making this program a successful event. And next, I would like to thank our office staff and our PhD scholars for their technical support. And I show appreciation to all the people who have been, strength of this study circle program. And you have made this program, you have made the best arrangement, I must say, for this program. And so I appreciate all of you. And I also appreciate our convener, Dr. Rahul Maurya, for organizing such a wonderful program. And I would like to take, because you all are listening us very patiently, so Professor Bagre sir, Professor Durgesh Chaudhary sir, Dr. Rajiva, Dr. Niti, Dr. Kalpana, everyone, thank you thank you all for being here and making this seminar very productive. Last but not least, my deep sense of appreciation goes to the audience, of course, who has participated in this seminar. So thank you all for making this seminar meaningful, productive, and interesting. So thank you. And now I would request Dr. Rahul Maurya, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Priyanka, for your vote of thanks. So now, with the permission of head of the department and chair of this session, we would like to bring this session to an end. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you everyone. Thank you.